Okay. Hello, everybody. I hope you're having a good day and ready for a Christmas break. Um, as always, if you have any questions or having any kind of technical difficulty, just please put it in the group chat. I'm Tara. It's good to see some familiar names out there. We just some updates on some things coming up on December 17th. We are going to do a virtual meeting for the people in the intro class, and I'll send out an email out the next couple days. Also on December 17th, we are going to do a virtual meeting to look at kind of gathering people together to look at the spring conference and what topics people would like. We're going to do for the spring conference, we're going to do more of a showcase. And so we're going to have more breakouts. So, if you want to be a part of that and contribute, please join us on December 17th. That's in the newsletters. I've been sending out monthly newsletters. So if you're not getting those, please let me know. They'll be coming through Constant Contact. And then the next virtual meeting will be January 14th from noon to 1. And we're going to have AbleTech here to talk about assistive technology. So I'm really excited to have them. It's a great organization. And I think that is it right now. One other thing is I've had several questions about continuing ed certificates for this. And due to just the difficulty with knowing who's going to be on here, how long you stay, we can't offer continuing ed for this. So it's just more just learning for your own pleasure. I think that's it. Like I said, if you have any questions, please put it in the chat box. Today we have Seth Kastner presenting from the Oklahoma Autism Center. Seth is a research assistant. He does a lot for the Autism Center. He's been there since it started, and he does a lot with screenings, with early access, and does a lot to support early foundations. And so he is going to talk about autism spectrum disorders. If you have questions related to his presentation, once again, put it in the chat, and I will either have him answer it or we'll answer it at the end of the training. So thank you guys for joining us, and just let me know if you have any questions. I'm going to turn it over to Seth.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. There's quite a bit of content in here. Some of it will probably be kind of refresher stuff. I'm sure most of you have some experience working with children with autism and some general knowledge. So a lot of that stuff I'll kind of breeze through. I want to leave a lot of room for questions and things like that at the end. But as Tara said, if you have questions during it, feel free to put those in the chat box, and I can either address those immediately or we'll bookmark them for later. But yeah, otherwise, let's go ahead and get into it. So we do know that autism is a neurodevelopmental disability, which basically just means that it is something that is brain-based. There are differences. We'll talk a little bit about some of the research on that here in a little bit. It's something that's lifelong and shows up very early in life. By definition, it has to be something that's evident in the first 3 years of life. But there's really good indicators that, for instance, when children who have been diagnosed with autism, there have been studies that have done retrospective analysis of like video from their first birthday, because that's commonly a thing that people have videotape of. And so even in reviewing that, they can see that children, even though they probably weren't diagnosed till after 3, actually there were signs, like they could do blind coding of 1-year-old videos, and they could essentially see some of these early traits of autism, even when kids were only 1 year old. There's a whole lot of variability in autism. We'll talk more about that too. The idea of severity is one that's probably not great and probably not that accurate. It kind of falls in line with kind of the idea of kind of traditional low functioning autism and the kind of functioning labels and severity labels. We can talk a little bit more about that. really aren't that accurate in terms of describing kind of the diverse set of symptoms and the way that autism presents differently in different people. Um, the main domains that are involved in autism are basically social communication and repetitive and restricted behaviors and interests. Talk a little bit about how those work and how that's kind of changed. I don't know if you guys can hear the children, but there's some children outside my office where I work at Early Foundation. So you might hear some kids hollering and playing and having fun in the background. So there are a lot of stereotypes about autism and a lot of kind of stigmas and all sorts of things that kind of stretch way back. You'll notice the last one on this list is the idea that autism might be caused by bad parenting. That was a very early idea when autism was kind of first identified back in the 60s and 70s. And we know that that's definitely not the case. And it's also, not child choosing to be unruly, misbehaving. That is something that we have to fight because that is something that people often still tend to assume, especially with autism being something that's not necessarily clearly identifiable at a glance. So that can be kind of a difficulty when we're dealing with those issues. It also is not mental illness. We'll talk a little bit about how it relates to some mental health issues, but it is a different category of things as a neurological disorder. In terms of autism's prevalence, like I said, back early on, the 60s and 70s is when it was kind of first described in the literature by two people, actually. That's why for a while there was Asperger's and autism. Although even if you look back to, we think of it as a fairly recent development, the lumping of those things together. But for instance, if you actually look back at what Hans Asperger was describing, which became Asperger's syndrome, at the same time that Leo Connor was describing autism, they're actually, even at that point in the initial descriptions, they very much were connected and kind of describing the same thing. Although it took everybody a long time to really realize how much that was. That's why they've only been combined in the same disorder with the most recent DSM. And we'll talk about some of those changes in a second. Back then, though, it was considered a very rare disorder. We're talking as few as 1 in 5,000 children were believed to have autism back then. You can see that in 2000, which is where this graph starts, that's when the CDC set up a monitoring network to specifically conduct surveillance on autism. And you can see kind of how the trajectory of that has gone up, has flattened out a little bit over the last couple of years, even though there still was an increase. The 2014 data is the most recent that we've got. And that's on a kind of on a delay. So we should have more data from 2016 coming out soon. Really, when we look at why this is, a lot of times you'll hear people kind of describe it in a very sensationalized way as, kind of the autism epidemic. And a lot of times the assumption that's made about that is that something is changing, that there is something that's causing autism that has increased massively. There is the possibility that there are some environmental risk factors that have increased. We'll talk about some of those here in a minute too, but the example that it gives on this slide you can see is the age of the parent. And that's an example of something that has changed with time. For instance, now, people are having children later in life compared to, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. But in general, the vast majority of that increase in autism prevalence can be attributed to the fact that we understand and are aware of autism a lot more than we were. We have improved diagnostic criteria. We're better at catching all sorts of different cases. Particularly, we're better at identifying cases of autism that don't kind of fit that traditional classic autism mold. And a lot of what that means is that, when people think about, a lot of times people say, well, back when I was a kid or back when I started teaching, there weren't all these kids with autism. The reality is there probably were. And especially if you go far enough back, you're going to run into the fact that a lot of times, people who probably should have been diagnosed with autism or would have been if, the diagnosis was around and well understood, were generally either kind of considered just odd or quirky, and were maybe not identified with anything, even though they probably did have the exact same deficits and struggles and difficulties, as well as children who were probably lumped in to other generic categories. And in many cases back then, the social isolation of families who had individuals with autism in them, as well as, to be honest, institutionalization, it was going to be generally a lot less visible. And when people did see it, they wouldn't necessarily know what it was, or they would lump it in with something else. Now, one of the things that's always been very clear from kind of the very beginning is that it seemed like a lot more boys had autism than girls. Right now, the latest prevalence numbers put that at about 4 boys for every 1 girl that has autism. And this actually is a slight decrease. This disparity has decreased. The 2 years before that data, the 2012 data, had it at 4.5 to 1. So it has inched down a little bit. So this kind of brings up the question of, why is this the case? There is the possibility that there is something about males that puts them at higher risk for developing autism. There are some theories that kind of were built around that, actually. It's kind of fallen out of favor, but there was some research and some theories kind of in development about the idea that autism was to some degree related to kind of a hyper-masculinization of the brain. And they did some research and stuff that looked at things like, basically, hormone exposure in utero, things like that. And there, that for a while seemed like it might be something, but like I said, that's fallen a little bit out of favor, and it doesn't necessarily seem like that's what's going on. There may still be some things that we don't understand that put boys at higher risk for autism, but that's kind of still something we're going to have to find out. One thing that we do know is that autism does present differently in boys versus girls. This can be related to a lot of things. In some instances, there's a lot of interesting research now kind of going on about, and this comes out anecdotally from a lot of individuals with autism, especially women that I've heard talk about this, which is that, for instance, it oftentimes seems like girls are somewhat better at camouflaging or masking, essentially kind of developing ways to compensate for the more noticeable characteristics of their autism. For instance, there's research that shows that girls with autism are actually better at implementing nonverbal communication, and doing things that basically, while they may still have the same deficits, they're not as noticeable, and they're not necessarily going to have the same obvious characteristics that we would typically associate. Because it's kind of a self-perpetuating thing, because if you see autism primarily as something that's affecting boys, that's going to be how you define it, is how it looks for them. So there probably have been a lot of girls that have been missed. A lot of times girls will get diagnosed later. There's research that shows that, for example, when you look at ADOS scores, that's the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, it's kind of the gold standard for autism assessment. In general, girls will score lower. Girls that have autism will score lower on the ADOS in their kind of total score than males. The other thing that happens, though, is that girls actually have a wider variance. So whereas boys are relatively kind of clustered in the middle with their scores, there are more girls that are either higher scored or lower scored than the average girl. So you see a lot more variance, and it looks different. And so that's kind of a big part of why I personally would definitely kind of expect to see in the future, as we understand this better, that disparity in boys versus girls to decrease, and potentially even maybe go away entirely. But that's probably only going to take a while. We also see some differences in identification of ASD between different racial and ethnic groups. When we look at it and kind of do across the board kind of blind, there's basically no reason to believe that there is any real difference in the incidence of autism between groups, but identification definitely does have some disparities. For instance, Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black youth children are diagnosed less often and are diagnosed later. So, and similarly with the boys versus girls, that disparity has decreased over time, and that's actually been more marked than the change. Yes, we will get a copy of the handout sent out at the end of this, by the way. Yeah, so I can show you a graph that kind of shows what that looks like. So this is an example. There's a bunch of really good data tools recently put out by the CDC. This is from their website, that monitoring network that I told you about that they established in 2000, or they started reporting data from in 2000. They've got a bunch of cool tools like this where you can look at all sorts of different things, and you can look at the different sites that they use. They have several sites throughout the country where they collect this data. But you can see here that there's still some significant differences. So on the far right, 2014, that's the latest data. And you can see that those different colored lines are clustered closer together, which is good. Because like I said, there's no reason to believe that these disparities actually reflect the, the actual amount of autism that's happening in these communities. It's really just a measurement detail. So things that probably are affecting these demographic disparities, stigma can be a huge thing, and that exists, to one degree or another in all groups. But it seems to more likely play a larger role in minority groups. Disparities in access to healthcare services can also be a major factor if they're just really aren't availability or there isn't good access. This has to do with socioeconomic stuff. For some populations, it also has to do with immigration status. And for some of those other immigrant type people, language barriers can often be a thing, as well as just kind of how things are communicated cross-culturally. For instance, if we have all this work, we talked about how that a lot of things have changed, how aware of autism people are, how knowledgeable they are about autism. A lot of that is the work of people taking efforts to noisy. Sorry, I just muted somebody. If you have a question that you're wanting to ask, you can type it though. Yeah, so essentially there's been a lot of work to promote awareness of autism in recent years. And if that's not reached, that a lot of times is not going to reach groups that have different cultural contexts, different language contexts. So there's a lot that can still be done with that, and probably some of the decrease in those disparities we've seen are a result of that. There also are particular cultural competency issues to keep in mind. For instance, a lot of the things that we do with early identification and developmental monitoring, those things can definitely be impacted by, for instance, the fact that some cultures, a lot of things that we talk about, like things like eye contact, are something that we focus on in terms of an early warning sign for something like autism. But that is a kind of a socially constructed behavior too. So in some cultural contexts, eye contact, particularly between children and adults, isn't viewed the same way. And might not be expected or considered appropriate. You get the same thing with how much adults communicate with children or talk to children. That can differ across communities, as well as things like just different parenting and family styles. So when the cultural context change, that doesn't mean that autism is not there. That just means your opportunities for seeing the signs that we traditionally expect might be different, and you might need to be aware of that stuff. Okay. So I had a question about the rise in 2010 and then the slight drop and trending up again. So yeah, so there was the little bit of leveling out that happened. And I think that part of this is just because we're only getting this data, every 2 years. You don't really have a continuous stream of data. So it's not going to be super smooth. There are going to be some kind of jagged things, but I think that is an example of a starting to level out, even though it did tick back up. I think we're probably not going to see, you know, if you look at, for instance, from 2008 to 2010, that's a pretty big jump compared to the 2012 to 2014. So while we may still see occasional upticks, some of that too can have to do with, that was also around the time where some of the changes with the DSM, the new DSM were coming out. So that could have affected things a little bit differently because, yeah, the way we define it impacts how many people are going to get identified with it. But in general, I'd say there's nothing particularly meaningful in that, apart from the fact that like we probably are going to see that start to kind of smooth out, because basically the closer we get to kind of the real true prevalence, the more we'll expect that to kind of be stable across time. Okay. So there also are other things that are often kind of found in conjunction with autism. These aren't a part of the autism itself. And one of the things that I always like to keep in mind is that any medical condition, any sort of condition, any sort of background can be combined with autism. So some things, specifically seizures, are very closely related. There's definitely has always been known that there is a percentage of children with autism that also have seizure disorders. Sleep disturbances, eating issues, GI stuff often come into it. There's a pretty good overlap with ADHD and other attention deficit type stuff. A lot of kids especially kids who are diagnosed later in life, will have an ADHD diagnosis and then will be diagnosed with autism. There are genetic disorders that are, for instance, Down syndrome. And this is something that I think that a lot of times is another example of why sometimes it's difficult to identify everybody that has autism, because a lot of times there may be something like a genetic disorder, like, childhood trauma or other kind of global delays that make it kind of hard to see the autism. But that doesn't mean, it's like, the kid, if it's 1 in 59 kids has autism, then 1 in 59 kids with cerebral palsy is probably going to have autism too. And it's just a matter of being able to keep that in mind and not just assume that because you see something else obvious going on, that autism isn't also at play. Anxiety and phobias often can come along with autism as well. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we kind of talk about lifespan issues and stuff like that. So we don't really know the cause of autism. We do know that there definitely is a strong genetic influence. At this point, it means we know it's genetic. We know it can run in families. We also know that those genes and their interactions with each other, the kind of the epigenetics of it, how the genes interact with the environment and when they're activated, is very complicated. I think the last list that I looked up, some of the recent genes, it's in the dozens. I think I looked at one list that was like 30 something odd genes that had kind of been clearly linked to some degree of risk with autism. But again, this is not like a chromosomal disorder or like a single gene mutation or anything like that, where you can do a test and say, oh, this person has this gene, they have autism because of that. It's basically these kind of associations. And we know that this gene makes it slightly more likely that somebody may end up with autism. Another thing along with that is that the way that the genes interact with the environment. And the reality is we're probably looking at a thing where multiple causal factors combine to manifest as autism. And there's also the very clear possibility that what we consider autism now, this disorder, is actually potentially a kind of a cluster of related disorders that all kind of affect the brain and behavior in a similar way. So in the future, we may, we saw kind of the clumping of things like PDD, NOS, and autism and Asperger's together. As we understand more about them, we may eventually see that kind of split off into different autisms. So some of the clear ways that we know about the genetic components in autism is through twin studies and family studies. So it is not the case that if you have an identical twin that has autism, that their other twin necessarily has autism. In the vast majority of cases, 77% of the time, that is the case. If you have fraternal twins, that's a little bit more than siblings, but in the same ballpark. It kind of means that there's kind of double the chance that the second twin or the second child will be diagnosed with autism, but you can see that's a little bit higher, 31% versus kind of a 20% chance for siblings. And yeah, so I mean, that shows that there is a clear genetic component, but not 100% genetics. Otherwise you would expect to see higher than that with identical twins especially. So as I kind of just mentioned, risk and cause are not the same thing. Usually we're talking about multiple risk factors, none of which can really be pinpointed as a cause. So even when I look at environmental risk factors like these, you can't tie these directly. And in most cases, the only way that we can even tell that these things are related, in the same way that with the genes, the only way that we can tell that they are a risk factor or related some way to autism is by doing kind of massive studies that look at hundreds and hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. There's actually a really huge study, the SEED study that the CDC is doing, that involves some interesting genetic stuff right now. And so hopefully in the next few years, we'll have really good info from that really big, ambitious study. But so for instance, we do know that like advanced age of the parent, either the mother or father, any sort of pregnancy or birth complications, even things that it's even harder to see what would be going on there, like the timing between births. So if two children are born really close together, that second child is at risk for autism slightly more. The same thing if there's a gap of 5 years or more, which is, again, it's hard to understand why that would be the case. And like I said, this risk is not cause. For instance, I would never tell anybody that I would predict that their child would have autism because one of these things is in place. Because these are, like I said, very small levels of correlation, and they definitely are related, but that is combined with tons of factors, most of which are poorly understood. Vaccines aren't a thing that has any bearing on autism, really. We know that specifically. Probably it was one of those things that there wasn't ever really a good reason to do a lot of research on them. The kind of the original stuff that brought it up turned out to be kind of fraudulent research. So, but after that, there were a lot of really good studies on it that showed very clearly that there's not a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. So earlier on the slide, we mentioned autism as a lifelong disability. We do know that it's something that's not outgrown. There's not a cure at this time, and there's really no reason to think that because of, we said, it basically is a lifelong neurodevelopmental disability. And so I think kind of it's, in some ways, it's a mistake to kind of think in terms of a cure. Really what we should be focusing on is the things that we can do to improve quality of life, provide support, develop and improve their skills and functioning in the world. Okay, we're going to kind of blast through some of this stuff. I have not seen the Magic Pill documentary. I mean, there are some things. So what we kind of seen and what the research shows is that, like I said, there are often, a subset of children or adults even who do have dietary issues alongside autism, or sometimes it will be dietary issues related Two characteristics of autism, for instance, there's a lot of people with autism that are very kind of picky eaters, a lot of stuff that falls into um, that falls into a relation to the repetitive and restrictive interests and behaviors. So yeah, it does not surprise me that there are some individuals for whom making accommodations and modifications to to their diet can really help. But there's not really a good body of research on that as kind of a core intervention, or as something that really can be applied. And again, that's something that as we understand more about the different causes, the different types, we may be able to get somewhere else with that. But yeah, there definitely are, and I wouldn't discount any individual case of any sort of change, be it dietary, behavioral, environmental change, that can kind of cause a breakthrough and can cause an improvement of life for a person. But but there's not really good evidence overall that would apply those sort of dietary things to the autism spectrum as a whole. As I mentioned, we have this kind of in the latest DSM, autism spectrum disorder kind of subsumed what was kind of autism or classic autism and Asperger's and PDD and OS. Another thing that was added is kind of this notion of the level of support, which is a part of the DSM now, and it's still, it's still kind of not. Yeah, I think it's definitely, for instance, a more useful way to look at, things that we would have called severity or high versus low functioning, but it also still is a little bit reductive. Because in this instance, they talk about kind of different levels of support in different domains, which starts to get more granular and get more accurate. But like I say, the reality is that it's very complicated. And for instance, some individuals may need substantial support in many categories, even though they might be considered high functioning, low functioning. And a lot of times that ends up being just kind of a stand-in for verbal communication abilities, for instance, which isn't necessarily an indicator of kind of how much support they're going to need in general. So I'm going to try to keep moving because we're already getting along in time. So in terms of how this looks in the neuroanatomy of people with autism, we do know that there are definite structural differences. We see things like overall, during certain phases of life, for instance, children with autism will actually show a massive amount, an unexpected amount of growth in neural connections. It's kind of big bloom that their neurotypical peers aren't seeing. And again, this is something that's kind of conducted on a massive scale with lots and lots of participants. And so you can't in any individual case pinpoint or identify autism this way. Hopefully in the future, we'll be able to work towards ways to identify autism looking at the brain, but that's not where we're at now, and that's not what this stuff I'm showing you is talking about. We also do see differences in the brain function. So what connections are firing off when perceiving faces, when doing perceptual processing. So we can definitely see differences there. I'll show a quick example of that too. And when I mentioned the idea that hopefully we're working towards being able to identify and even diagnose autism with things that biomarkers, what we call them, which are basically just things that we can measure physically in terms of brain activity to identify autism. So eye tracking is another example that's not directly, it's kind of a secondary thing. Rather than looking directly at the brain, you're looking at something very closely connected to it, which are your eyeballs, and where a person's attention goes. So we often see that children with autism will, when we look at eye tracking studies, will, instead of looking a person in the eyes, will actually focus on their mouth and neck. We see this with really young children. I'll show you examples of that real quick here. There are also things like functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, and even really cool EEG stuff that's less invasive, where you can basically kind of look at how the electrical activity in the brain works in response to certain stimulus. So this is an example of a 14-month-old, typically developing child. And this is literally what the children in the study are seeing. They're seeing a screen that is split. One side, you've got a child moving around, several children, and then you've got several different geometric patterns going. So just kind of watch. As the circle grows, that shows how long the child is looking at that same spot. And you can see in this case, there is some direction of attention towards the geometric shape, but the overall majority of it is staying on the kids on the right. Now we'll look at a contrasting example. This is a 15-month-old who was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. So you'll see there is some switching back and forth, some looking at the kid, but especially as the video goes on, you'll see that there's a lot of attention being paid over the geometric shapes, which in my mind, is kind of understandable to some degree because it's very interesting to look at. The idea here is that it's something that is drawing their attention away from, for what other kids would be, kind of the human social aspect would be what would make the right side more interesting. Okay, we'll keep moving. Yeah, we'll go really fast through these because I'm sure most of you are in general pretty familiar, and this is pretty basic stuff. The two domains, like we said, are language and communication is the first one we'll talk about. Usually language delays or atypical language development. That's one of the things that kind of classic autism is always accompanied by delayed language, lack of speech early on, at the very least. But as we understand it better, a typical language development is also important. So, for instance, a child who may actually be hyperverbal when they're young, but doesn't use that communication appropriately socially. The kind of old school Asperger's, the kid that kind of talks like a professor, or a kid who has a lot of language, but it's very scripted or very repetitive. Later on that can manifest in difficulty initiating and sustaining conversations. And like I said, a lot of repetitive or stereotyped use of language, echolalia, things like that. Pretend play. So that's what I say, like the language and communication stuff really is now combined with the social stuff. So before there were kind of three domains. It was, social, communication, repetitive, and restrictive. To me, it makes a lot of sense to combine the social and the communication because that does describe really how closely entwined. There is no such thing as non-social communication. All communication is social. And all social interaction is communicating something. Rebecca, we will talk about that here in just 1 second once I get to the next slide. So the other thing that we see, like I said, is restricted, repetitive, stereotyped behaviors. So these are, interests that are odd either in what the interest is in or in the intensity of the interest. Rigid adherence to routines and rituals, stereotyped and repetitive motor mannerisms, preoccupations with parts of objects. So we had a question that Rebecca asked, says, where do you see gross motor delays as early indicators of autism? So that is something that we do definitely see in a subset of kids. And a lot of times it looks different from traditional motor delays. And sometimes what that can be an indicator of is that it actually is, in a sense, a side effect of these kind of restricted, kind of idiosyncratic behaviors that we see. So in the same way that sometimes we'll see children with autism that will, regress in language or make a big leap in language, like they're basically just kind of start talking in full sentences and really won't be interested in talking before that. You see the same thing that a lot of times children with autism, for instance, will be late walkers. And sometimes it will literally be the case that they just won't try to walk, won't make efforts to walk, won't kind of do this intermediary steps. And they'll just kind of start walking once they can do it all by themselves. And so some of those motor delays have to do with things like that, like kind of being very rigid, or for instance, not being motivated by those little in-between steps and just not having the same interests. So for instance, a lot of motor development stuff oftentimes is really tied up in social interaction with the parents. There is a huge thing. You think about a kid learning to crawl, making their first steps, things like that. There's a lot of that is social. And the kid that's smiling at the parent because they know what's going on here and they're getting this encouragement, but that sort of social reinforcement, things like that, aren't necessarily going to be motivating to children with autism. So, I mean, I don't know. There is more research on kind of how motor stuff relates to to early signs of autism, but that's kind of what the experience that I've had with it, and the stuff that I've read kind of focuses on those things. Another question, do you ever see these behaviors not occur at an early age, but occur in grade school, teenage years? Yes. So there's ways that signs of autism can change, sometimes dramatically, throughout childhood and throughout the lifespan. One reason for that, especially with the social and communication stuff, is that for a lot of children, the differences between them and their neurotypical peers at an early age aren't going to be as noticeable, and their struggles aren't going to be as intense. But what happens as kids get older is the social world gets much more complicated. When you think of a child, kind of in like an early childhood age, when you think of a toddler, kid in kindergarten or pre-K, the social world isn't that complicated. You might get some interaction, you might be mainly parallel play, might be kind of, not hitting classmates, but then you start to think about what happens when you get into middle school, junior high, high school. That can kind of cause some new struggles for a lot of people who do have social deficits, but they're really only become starkly clear when the social world gets that complicated. And that can result in other behavioral things as well. Also, in general, when it comes to restricted, repetitive, stereotype behaviors, things like that, these things often change, not even just in terms of like special interest shifting, but there are often stereotype behaviors that will kind of switch or manifest later in life too. So I hope that kind of gets at that question. It's complicated, but these things within you see a whole variety of ways these things manifest between different people with autism, but even individuals with autism can have significant changes in the way these things manifest throughout their life. So some of the other ways that these things can kind of affect things on a daily level, you've got difficulties in routines, insistence on the sameness, difficulties kind of self-soothing, and then unusual interests. We can see very different things in terms of overactivity and underactivity. The underactivity is something that I think is often really important to be mindful of, because I feel like a lot of times the kids who are least well served kind of by our supports and our systems are the kids who don't necessarily have the all over the place, very kind of in your face behaviors and things that you're forced to deal with. Because a lot of times you'll have kids that may be struggling and may need just as much support, but they aren't going to get as much attention because their behaviors aren't as outwardly focused. You do have also sensory stuff related to pain, sounds and smells. Sleeping, eating difficulties already mentioned. We'll just skip right over that because we're running out of time. Concrete and literal thinking, abstract concepts, kind of some of that stuff that we kind of in general as neurotypical folks take for granted. The things that just kind of automatically click for us aren't necessarily for a person whose brain works differently due to autism. Attention problems, we mentioned the ADHD sort of stuff often overlaps. Distraction, difficulty with transitions, things like that. We'll skip over that one too. You guys can look through this too. If you have any questions afterwards, just email me. Difficulty generalizing skills. So a lot of times someone with autism may learn something, but they may learn it very specifically as it applies to one specific setting. And it might not be something that they can apply in other settings and other circumstances. Executive functioning is also an important concept. And I've heard a lot of adults with autism talk about this. And just kind of that, that ability to manage your behavior, your life, regulating emotions, organizing, planning, that sort of stuff. And that can be the stuff that can be very difficult, especially for people who are, trying to, develop as much independence as possible. There are also a lot of strengths related to memory, being able to learn things very well, but mainly through routine and practice. Areas of interest are also big strengths that can be applied in all sorts of aspects of life. Objectivity, visual processing is also a really strong skill. We know that early intervention is really important, and specifically kind of the development of things like language and early social communication skills are huge for long-term success. So this is kind of the rest of kind of all of the random things, and most of this will kind of follow up with depending on what questions you have. But these are some other things that I think are pretty important to consider. For one, I highly encourage people to listen to and include self-advocate perspectives. So there are lots of people with autism. There are lots of them who actually are very good at communicating their own experiences and the experiences of people in their community. There actually is a really strong community of self-advocates. They're all over the place. There's books. There's, I follow a lot of people on Twitter, for instance, that tweet about these issues and their experiences. And it can key you into a bunch of stuff. I mean, that's kind of how you guys, I'm sure, know about person-first identity. Person-first language, which is the idea of saying a person with autism rather than an autistic or an autistic person. And I think that definitely came out of a good place, specifically, the idea of, for instance, referring to somebody as an autistic, because that seems very dehumanizing. It's also true, though, that many people, and in terms of like kind of the active self-advocate community, there is an actual preference for identity first language. So people referring to themselves as I am autistic. I'm an autistic person, because that is a part of who they consider that as an important part of who they are as a person. It's part of their identity, and they don't want to see it the same way that you would say, oh, I have a cold. They don't have autism like somebody has cold. It is actually a part of who they are, part of the way their brain works. And so a lot of people do actually prefer identity first language. That ties in pretty closely with neurodiversity, kind of the idea that as a society, we need to kind of increase our understanding of the fact that people's brains work differently, and that is okay. So yeah, neurodiversity, highly recommend looking into more of the thoughts on that, especially from people with autism or autistic people. There's also some really interesting stuff that I found from listening to people who have autism or advocating for their stuff. And this is actually, there's some research that's kind of starting to be done on this, because it definitely does seem to be the case that people with autism, in terms of being neurodivergent in general, often that does seem to map onto higher levels of identification with the LGBT community, and kind of some really, really fairly strong correlations. I mean, again, not everybody, but there are higher levels of people who identify, for instance, as non-binary, or who see themselves as asexual or in some other way kind of not fitting the norms as far as gender and sexual orientation go. Hopefully there'll be some more good research on that as well in the future. All right, I'm going to just kind of breeze through these last couple. Things across the lifespan. A lot of times we talk about, and we hear so much from families and people with autism about kind of that cliff that you can drop off of kind of after high school, where there's so much fewer supports. And there are a lot of issues that can be addressed. A lot of that stuff that I was talking about with the executive functioning is stuff that a lot of people in early adulthood deal with. This is also where a lot of that stuff that we talked about with anxiety, depression as well. There are actually really high rates of self-harm and suicide in young adults with autism. In general, the lifespan of people with autism is significantly lower. And so there's a lot to be done in terms of kind of expanding the work that we're doing with children across the lifespan. There's also a lot that can be, there's much higher levels of trauma across the lifespan, including in childhood with autism. And a lot of that has to do with everything from kind of stigma and just essentially living in a world that isn't built for the way that your brain works. That can cause some trauma that can compound a lot of the issues that already exist. And then in general, just encourage everybody to kind of try to keep up and stay informed with what's going on in research. I use Google Scholar all the time. I've got like Google alerts when certain types of research come out. I can just get that in my email. And anytime I see, a headline that's, says some sensational thing about autism, immediately I go try to figure out what that actually came from and what the research is really saying. Because a lot of times it's very easy to kind of get clickbaity, sensationalized ideas floating around in public that don't necessarily map on to what the research is actually doing, because it's usually always more complicated and less clear-cut and less magical than it's made to seem. Okay, so we do have a few minutes left for questions. If there's anything in particular or anything that I didn't cover that you're interested in, if I don't have an answer off the top of my head, I can definitely get you in touch with somebody who does or with a resource.
Thank you, Seth.
Yeah.
This was so helpful. Seth has his email on there if you guys have any questions. The Oklahoma Autism Center provides more training on autism and behavior. I recorded this, so you'll have access to it again. And then also I will email you guys out the PowerPoint. As long as you signed up through Constant Contact, I have your email address that way.
Yeah. So there is a question about sensory integration therapy. I don't really have much experience with that. I will say that, there definitely, a lot of kids definitely do have sensory related issues. What we focus on doing with, with that is not, in the programs that we have, we don't really incorporate sensory integration therapy directly. It's more a matter of kind of being mindful of that stuff. And a lot of times it's, we like to think about the kind of the sensory aspects in terms of how a child is processing sensory information. And so really that's what we focus on, is basically, shaping the environment and giving supports for a child to do what they need to do and to learn. And so with that, we haven't, and most of the kids that I've worked with directly are toddlers, where we don't see a lot of sensory integration therapy being used, even from outside providers. So I'm afraid I don't know a whole lot on that.
I think, Seth, you bring up a great point, is that, really where most of the literature says is to look at sensory as like preferences. And so really helping to see what the child's preferences are and how can we build that naturally into the environment. Where, you think about children with autism, their biggest deficits are, communication, social interaction, adaptive skills. And so really working on those and teaching those skills, and teaching them how to communicate what they need and what they don't need. And so setting up individuals, yes, you're exactly right. So looking at how can we set up environments that meet the needs of their different sensory needs, and teaching them how to communicate that too. It's a great question. Okay, well, thank you, Seth. We appreciate it. And if you guys have any more questions, give Seth a shout.
Yeah, if you're also curious about any of the stuff we do at the Oklahoma Autism Center, we have opportunities to come look at our early intervention model here at Early Foundations. I also do a lot of stuff with screening and early identification, and we train people in that, as well as do trainings for all sorts of school people through the MESA project. So if you have any questions about stuff I said today or anything else that we do, or just about autism stuff in general, we've got a great team here. It's got a pretty broad base of expertise. So yeah, let us know.
Thanks again, Seth.
Yeah, thank you.
You guys for joining us.